Our closing roundtable session. I would really like to be able to thank each of our panelists individually. However, in the interest of time, I'd like to recognize them as a group. So those who participated in the formal education and literacy panel, could you please stand? Are they in here? I'm sure there's people in here. There we go. Thank you. Health education and literacy. Those panel members, please stand or raise your hands. I know you're here. Thank you. Economic development and literacy. Those panelists, please stand as well. Thank you. And the final panel was conflict, human rights, and literacy. Please stand as well. And thank you all for sharing your expertise and time with us this afternoon. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Robert Jones, our Senior Vice President for System Administration at the University of Minnesota. Robert Jones has been a very strong supporter of international initiatives at the University of Minnesota, and he is one of the reasons for the focus on Africa in the international program, in our Global Spotlight program for these 2 years. He truly exemplifies dedication to higher education, research and scientific inquiry, and international cooperation and collaboration. He arrived at the university in 1978 as a professor of agronomy and plant genetics and is now an internationally recognized authority on plant physiology, having published more than 100 scientific papers and manuscripts. Among his many, both academic and administrative achievements, he served for 10 years as an academic and scientific consultant for Archbishop Tutu's South African education program, enabling hundreds of African students to attend American universities. And he has for many years been a strong proponent of partnerships with African universities. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much, Carol. It's indeed an honor and pleasure to be with you on this very, very important occasion. It is my honor to introduce this very distinguished panel that will be wrapping up a very exciting day of dialogue about the very important issue of education in Africa. The first person I'd like to introduce is someone that I had a chance to meet for the first time at lunch today, and that's Ambassador Dr. Augustine P. Mahiga. He's the permanent representative of the United Republic of Tanzania to the United Nations. And from 2005 to 2006, he led the Tanzanian team as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, and in January 2006 was appointed as the Council's president. Prior to being appointed as a permanent representative in 2003, Ambassador Mahiga worked for 10 years with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees as a deputy director for Africa and representative in Liberia, India, and Italy. He has co-authored a number of UN initiatives and commission and has been a diplomat in Ottawa and in Geneva. He is also an academic, having served on the faculty at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and has written extensively around the issues centering around regional cooperation, conflict resolution, peace building, and humanitarian development issues in Africa. Our next participant on the panel is Dr. Christopher J. Thomas. He is the World Bank's section manager for education in Africa. In this capacity, he supervises a team of specialists that provide analytical and advisory services and technical assistance and to finance and to improve educational systems. Dr. Thomas has also managed the World Bank's educational development programs in East Asia and has worked in Southern Asia and Northern Africa. Prior to joining the World Bank, he served as a consultant to the U.S. government in the UN. He has worked as a Peace Corps volunteer in Sierra Leone and holds an MA in International Affairs from Johns Hopkins University and a PhD in education from Stanford University. And last but certainly not least is someone, again, that I had a chance to meet also today, and that is Gillian Matkambi, who is the Vice Consul the Vice Consul General for South Africa. She is part of a team that oversees bilateral relationships between South Africa and 14 states in the Midwest. She has primary responsibility for focusing on social, economic, and political issues. She's been a part of the consulate office in Chicago for about 3 years now. She hails from Pretoria, South Africa, and is a graduate of the University of Pretoria. Each of our panelists would take about 7 minutes or so to provide some opening and framing comments. And then after that 7-minute period, they will engage in a dialogue among themselves and hopefully with the audience as well. So again, panelists, we thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this very important dialogue, and welcome again to the University of Minnesota.
Thank you. It's really nice for me to be here. It's so refreshing to see such an engaged and interested community and people that are interested in Africa that are working to make a difference on so many different levels. So this day has been a real pleasure for me. I was asked to talk a little bit about give a Pan-African perspective on education. That's a really challenging task. Africa, as you know, is so wildly diverse. 50 countries, hundreds of languages, very different economic circumstances from countries that have grown relatively well over the last decade and have a diverse economy, to commodity-dependent economies, to countries where the economies have been rather stagnant or even declining. There are countries that are in conflict, unfortunately, countries that are emerging from conflict, and countries that have been quite peaceful and stable for many years. So it's very, very hard to generalize, but let me try to do it in an optimistic way. I mean, the few things that I do see in my job is that there's a young generation of people in Africa that is large and that is ready for change. They're different from the generation before them. They're connected to the world in different ways. There are new communications. They're better educated. They're doing more diverse jobs than they did in the past. They're setting up businesses. They have different aspirations for themselves and different expectations of their governments. There's, in general, a rise of constitutionalism in Africa that is bringing with it a new sort of sense of people's rights and their ability to organize and to make governments more accountable. There is a more active civil society in Africa, which I think is having a very positive change. Education is one of the most important issues. It's also one of the most political issues. It's one of the few interventions the government has that reaches every household in the country. It's one of the investments that families make that go to extraordinary lengths to put their children into school, often using up half of their disposable income to put their children through primary school and struggling to, unfortunately, make choices on which ones go on for higher education. The bank, I run this group that at the World Bank that is in charge of education aid to Africa. We do three things. We provide large-scale financing for education systems. We provide policy advice to governments, and we provide training. It sounds a little mundane, but underneath that are some outcomes we would really like to see achieved. And I'm sorry if I'm a little bit repetitive for the people who are in the panel that I was on, but there are sort of 5 goals that I think I try to focus on. And I think there's pretty widespread agreement with other UN agencies and donors on this. And one is that we really try to find a way to ensure that kids arrive at school healthy and ready to learn. The malnutrition rates in Africa are still far too high. The interventions that early in life, especially from ages 0 to 2, that could improve cognitive development, that could improve health and nutrition of children, are very cheap and should be, they're low technology and they're cheap and they should be available to people. There's no reason why they are not. But we've got to have a conscious effort to get them out, roll them out to people, and provide them with opportunities. The second thing is, as many of you know, there's been an enormous drive to expand access to basic education in recent years. The Millennium Development Goals say that every child should complete an education, complete grade 6 by 2015. They have inserted a quality education in there. I think that was an assumption which proved not always to be right. So, our challenge, our conundrum, is to turn those physical spaces in school into learning spaces. It's hard to do when you have classrooms that have 100 children in them, that have a stressed teacher, that don't have supplies, basic supplies. But, it's going to take a lot of creative thought. It's going to take teacher training. It's going to take supply of books and materials. It's going to take community involvement in helping to make those schools work. The third issue is trying to make sure that kids leave the education system ready for the challenges that the labor market will bring them and that life will bring them, including being prepared to having some competence in how to protect themselves from HIV, having some competence in how to discuss issues peacefully, resolve differences, having some leadership qualities, and having a skill that is productive and they can ultimately be employed or self-employed and earn a living for themselves. Packed underneath that goal is a huge number of issues around access to secondary school, around curriculum reform. We were working with one country recently on a big secondary education expansion program, and that's the curriculum for secondary school had 24 subjects in it, including Greek and Latin as mandatory subjects. And the model that most people have of a good education is the education that they got. And there were a lot of high-quality schools, or there weren't a lot, there was a very small number of high-quality schools in Africa that a lot of today's current leaders went through in the ministry, and leaders in the Ministry of Education, and that is their deeply held conception of what a good quality school is. It's unfortunately not affordable on a mass scale, given the economic conditions in Africa now. It's going to take a huge subsidy in a long time frame to get people through that level of schooling. So we're trying to simplify the curriculum. We're trying to figure out how to train larger numbers of teachers. We're trying to figure out how to get various public-private partnerships where they're applicable to expand the capacity of the state to provide education. The fourth thing is to try to help universities become leading agents of social and economic change. We have some very good universities in Africa, and we have a lot of struggling ones. And they're struggling with their curriculum. They're struggling with research facilities. They're struggling to make a connection between the more innovative and productive sides of the economy and the education. They're struggling sometimes with politics over appointments, admissions, fees, and so forth. And they're generally less connected to the global higher education community than their counterpart universities in Asia and Latin America and Eastern Europe. So to try to find ways to foster the connections that bring them into the global education university community and make them more effective and more productive, and to sort of unleash the potential that is in those universities is quite a challenge. The final thing is making sure we get a public system that works, and packed underneath that are a range of issues around good governance, management systems, issues of accountability, delegation of, or clarity of roles between center and decentralized units, delineation of responsibilities within the system, and resources that will enable it to function at a very good level. Those are the challenges as the sort of puzzles we're struggling with. They're all huge, big issues. They need a lot of creativity. They need, I think, the resources of a lot of people to wrap their heads around those issues and find creative solutions. As we talked about in the last session, people often look at the big aid agencies and say, can you solve this problem? Aid to education in Africa is actually a relatively small proportion. I don't think it's more than 5% of the overall education budget in Africa. It's a lot of the investment budget, but it's not a lot of the overall budget. So the real puzzle is how do you make the whole system work better? I think the aid agencies generally work through governments. They work on issues of public spending, public administration, and so forth. There's also a huge role for NGOs that are able to connect to communities in ways that the bigger agencies cannot. And there's a huge role for the private sector in terms of, I think, creating opportunities for people to work and delivering essential services and goods to people that improve their lives. Well, thank you.
I should begin by thanking the University of Minnesota and the Books for Africa project for inviting me to participate in this symposium on education literacy in Africa. 2 weeks ago, I was invited to a book launch. The book is called The Great Education Airlift from Africa to the United States. This was the initiative of late President Kennedy and Tom Mboya of Kenya between 1959 and 1961, when literally more than 800 students were airlifted from East Africa, mainly Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and some from Zambia to come and study in the United States. That was the era of independence. That was the beginning and the era of civil rights in the United States, but it was a major symbolic and enduring relationship between independent Africa and the United States. The first president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, visited John Kennedy, and he wanted to be a participant to bring students here for further education. But at the time of independence, Tanzania didn't have enough students even to qualify for university. So Nyerere asked Kennedy that, why don't you build a university for me? And those were the origins of the University of Dar es Salaam. I'm so impressed that that tradition has survived and has gone through the test of time. The University of Minnesota is one of the few institutions that has continued that contact. Minnesota as a state is known for being a destination for immigrants, a destination for resettlement of refugees, and certainly a destination for students. And the university is renowned for its focus on Africa and continues to have relationship with African institutions. I was very encouraged this afternoon that although this education relationship between Africa and the United States was primarily between institutions like the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, of which I was a beneficiary, the Carnegie, and between universities, now we are told the United States government will take active involvement in encouraging and maybe even giving funding for the promotion of education assistance to Africa. I encourage you as an institution and as individuals to maintain this contact. I encourage you to have exchange programs, and I pay my respects to the faculty who have maintained this tradition. I'm very much proud to be part of this discussion this afternoon. Secondly, when we talk of education in Africa, it's very important to look at Africa not as one country, but as 53 countries, and look at each country's policy on education. It varies from country to country, especially on the priorities that governments do give to investment in education. There are governments that give priority, like my own country, that allocates 20% of its budget, actually to be precise, it's about 22% on education, and some countries as little as 9%. But so if you want really to understand the trends of education and the role of education in the development of Africa, you have to look at the policies of country to country. I must also, of course, I recall some of the external policies on African education policies, like the structural adjustment at some point, which did have an impact. That was the World Bank's suggestion on the provision of education in Africa. But I'm saying this because the government has a definitive role in providing the infrastructure for education. And there are some governments, fortunately now we don't have as many military governments as we used to have, that would spend more money on military hardware than on education. But now there is also an opening for the participation of the private sector in providing education. This raises some very fundamental policy issues. What is the relationship between government and the private sector? What is the regulatory mechanisms that have to be put in place? What kind of managerial requirements are needed? I think for students of education and interest in African education, you have to look at this and try to investigate this as well to get a true picture of how education is evolving and how education fits in the scheme of things for planning development in Africa. Thirdly is the current status. We have the Millennium Development Goals, and the target is to have universal primary education with equality on gender by the year 2015. This invariably necessitates high investment on primary education. We have done it in Tanzania, and we hope we shall meet the target by the year 2015. Enrollment in primary school and gender parity is at 92%. Those who are lagging behind are just pastoral societies like the Maasai, but in implementing this, we have created more problems. Primary education is important, but if that is an end in itself, it creates more challenges. You have to put these kids in secondary school. But we haven't been investing enough on secondary school and on tertiary education. Among the challenges which are relevant to what we are speaking of today, and especially for Books for Africa, are the following. We have schools that don't have books. Primary, secondary, even university. Let me acknowledge and encourage the Book for Africa project to continue. It's not enough to build schools. The political leadership has mobilized people to build structures, but these structures have no books, have no libraries. And Books for Africa, you are making a difference in shipping those books to Africa. The second challenge is teachers. I think this was very well articulated by Secretary Carson, and again it came up in the discussion prior to this panel, that there are not enough teachers, they are not good enough, they are not trained, and you cannot make a good student or a good learning environment without books, without teachers. And this would remain as a central challenge. And I think students who are taking education, institutions and governments that are willing to help Africa, especially post the Millennium Development Goals, when we have really reached this level of universal primary education, the challenge would be secondary schools. We need books, we need teachers. But Books for Africa is also playing another key role. We need a culture of reading books in Africa. That culture is now. When you hear that the President of the United States, who is actually the President of the world, in a way, reads books, and so many books a week, so many books a month, you wonder, where does he get the time? But he can make time. But this culture of reading has to be instilled. And Books for Africa, you provide books to schools, you provide books to libraries, you are helping and contributing to building a culture of reading books among Africans, especially the young generation. I appreciate it. The other challenge is schools without laboratories. Americans, you say laboratories? Whatever. You know, and this is a serious challenge. Without books, without teachers, without labs, what kind of product are you going to have? You may end up saying we have teachers, we have books, but they all end up studying the arts, the liberal studies, but no science, no physics, no chemistry, no math. Are you going to produce engineers? Are you going to produce agronomists? Are you going to produce doctors? This is what is lacking. So after the Millennium Declaration and Millennium Development Goals, the quality of education and the focus of an education will be tremendous. And these are the areas that we have to look at. Books for Africa, thank you for bringing books. Think of also bringing computers. This is a technological age. People have to be literate in reading. They have to be literate in information technology as well. We shall have to reach a time when if you cannot use a computer, you're an illiterate, like the one who cannot read ABC. I hope you'll branch and develop as you go along. And maybe even at a later stage, as you bring books, you could develop partnership with the private sector in Africa to go into the printing business in Africa. And this is what you are doing is good enough, but there is room for improvement. And I'm challenging you to do that. While talking about that, maybe let me not take too much time. This is the issue of curriculum. Secretary Carson said we want to build good governance, the rule of law. We want to build an entrepreneurial class in Africa. Gone are the days of the command economies of socialism, including my own countries. We want entrepreneurs, we want private practice, private enterprise. But you have to develop entrepreneurs. It could be built in the curriculum, or there could be additional institutions. There are women, there are young people who are ready to go into business, but they don't have the ABCs of bookkeeping, and this has to be integrated in the curriculum. We are producing these young people who have finished primary education. What are they going to do? Just to swell the ranks of the unemployed and become potential recruits for fighting, for terrorism? How do we prepare these young people who finish primary education, boys and girls, to be in society, to be self-sufficient? How does the curriculum respond to that? In fact, the beginnings of a middle class begin with secondary education. How do you develop a curriculum that is useful? And if they have to finish secondary education, how do they go? Agriculture is the backbone of many African countries. Agriculture is what would be the future of food security. And every country in the world, including the United States, started with the agricultural revolution. And if this curriculum does not reflect agricultural requirements, if our universities do not develop researchers into the science of agriculture, into the science of utilizing solar energy and wind, into the science of managing free enterprise, then we are defeating ourselves. Let me stop here, and I'll be ready to answer questions from the floor. Thank you.
Okay, I guess it's my turn now. First of all, as introduced by the moderator, my name is Gillian Mutlami. I represent the government of South Africa in the Midwest. I'm part of a team that comes from South Africa, a diplomatic team, obviously. We are based in Chicago. The host state is Illinois. We represent the government of the Republic of South Africa in the 14 states of the Midwest, ranging from Arkansas to Wisconsin. Every state that is part of the group of states in the Great Lakes of America, we do work there. Let me also extend my gratitude to Books of Africa for inviting the South African Consulate to be part of this great conference and to also be present tomorrow as we send off a container of books to South Africa in the Eastern Cape. We really appreciate, on behalf of my government, I would like to say we really appreciate that container of books. You don't know how much of a difference it makes in our communities. I've been asked to be part of this panel to articulate the South African government policy on education, and I hope to do justice to this in 7 minutes, which is not much, but I will try and articulate as much as I can about the South African policy on education. As the ambassador from Tanzania so eloquently stated, that Africa is made up of 53 different countries, all with different education policies. The South African education policy reflects the history of the country, if I may put it that way. There is a noticeable disparity in the education system, mainly because of the colonialist legacy of the country. However, that's not an excuse for the government to provide education to learners. Since the dawn of democracy 15 years ago, education has been a critical area of focus for the new government, and the education policy is spearheaded by the National Education Department. It has not been an easy task for the new government to integrate 9 different education departments that existed in the country prior democracy. The education system in South Africa prior democracy was structured such that you had 9 different departments in one country. Now you ask yourself, in a country that at that stage was 36 million people, had 9 different education departments. First of all, it's budget questions. Second is political decisions. You had education departments that were fully resourced to cater for the minority, and 3 education departments that were really under-resourced to cater for the majority of the population. That was the reality then in South Africa. Now, following democracy in 1994, the challenge was, how do you integrate 9 different education systems that were structured to divide the people and teach the majority of the population that they were submissive and they were the underdogs, whereas you had an education system that was fully funded and fully resourced, teaching the minority that they were superior and South Africa belonged to them. 15 years down the line, it's still a challenge to integrate all those institutions. However, the government is trying to do justice to the education system. The school system is structured such that it caters for learners in the 21st century era. We have what you call outcome-based education, in that this is a policy that the new government has adopted to try and impart life skills into children, at the same time incorporating that with formal education. The education system is structured such that it begins at the age of 6. Normally, school starts from grade 0 up to what we call matric, or your high school diploma, equivalent to your high school diploma in the United States. Children are normally, under normal circumstances, would start school at 6 years and then proceed then up to the age of 17 or 18, where then they would be expected to complete their high school into tertiary education, which of course also is one of the critical areas in the education policy of South Africa that is marred by problems. Old South Africa, or apartheid South Africa, had more than 15 universities that were also structured to cater for the population in accordance to race. You had excellent centers of learning like the University of Cape Town, the University of Pretoria, Universiteit van Free State, and Stellenbosch University, fully resourced higher education centers in Africa. However, they could not admit children of color. So it's only after independence in South Africa that these institutions were now mandated by the policy of government to admit students of color. Now, what we have now is previously disadvantaged black institutions under-resourced that used to cater for black children that are now mandated by the policy of government to be merged into the universities that were previously advantaged or that used to cater for, I would say, traditionally white institutions in South Africa. These measures on their own reflect the political tensions that are still there in the country, in that you have these two institutions previously disadvantaged and then another that was previously advantaged that have got to merge and come together and then merge their policies and their beliefs, and obviously the tensions that come out of there still present a challenge to the government. A closer look at the education system in South Africa reflects that the system is made up of basic education or primary level beginners. Then you have middle school education, where now children are taught more according to their development. Normally in middle school education, you find children who are going through adolescence and puberty, and now it's critical for the government to ensure that the component of life skills is imparted into the children. They understand what they're going through in the stage of life. Then you have high school education, where now the children are taught that they're now being prepared to go into tertiary education and to go and learn life skills and decide what they want to do about their future. The repercussions of measures, obviously, as I've stated, bring about political tensions in the country. However, the government is trying very hard to address those challenges. Then, following completion of high school, children now go into tertiary education, which I must say the government has done a very good job of trying to integrate all the universities that were there to create about 9 good institutions that cater from the arts up to engineering. Any discipline that you can think of, we do cater for in South Africa. The National Department of Education is the custodian for implementing educational policy. However, if you look at the political structure of South Africa, you don't have 9 provinces where in American terms you would refer to them as states that are then the custodians to implementing the education policy in the various areas of the country. Obviously, because of the legacy of the country and because of the history of the country, we still have areas where you find that South Africa is very progressive. Most of you, when you travel to South Africa, most people think that South Africa is made up of the Cape, Johannesburg, and Pretoria. That's not even the beginning of South Africa. South Africa is big. South Africa is huge. And where you see that disparity is in the area of education, in that the rural areas really under-resourced. Government is trying very hard to channel the resources into the rural areas. However, that's not happening at the rate that we would like it to happen. That is where then now organizations like Books of Africa play a pivotal role, in that they partner with their government to ensure that the resources that are so badly needed in the rural areas are now channeled there. I've been talking to, I think, the founder of Books for Africa and some of the officials who work for the organization, who informed me that they just shipped a container of books to the Eshawe region in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And now if you go to Eshawe represents a community where women and children are still regarded as secondary citizens, mainly because of the Zulu culture that dominates in the area. So now it's really good to see Books for Africa thinking about areas like Eshawe, and the container that's destined for South Africa tomorrow is going to the Eastern Cape, one of the very underprivileged areas where you still find learners learning under trees. It's a reality in South Africa. It is a reality in Africa. There is some areas of the country where you still find there are no schools, there are no formal school structures. Children still learn under trees. Teachers are under-resourced and they're under-trained. One teacher, I was just telling somebody today that one teacher who taught my eldest sister in 1979 still teaches children today. Now you ask yourself question, is she still being trained, or is she still imparting the same knowledge that she's been imparting 30 years back into a child who was born 6 years back? Now that clearly shows you the challenge that government is facing. However, if you go to predominantly white communities, you find that teachers are being serviced, teachers are being rotated. One teacher who taught in 1979 is now on pension, and a young girl like me is now teaching the youngsters, and that goes to show that government still has a lot of work to do in addressing the challenge, especially of disparity. And like the ambassador mentioned, South Africa is a center of excellence. All learners from Africa, some of them come to South Africa to come and get their high quality education. Also, government is an area where they need to balance to make sure that also our very own children are not left behind. The model of outcome-based education presents a challenge in that you have teachers who have been absorbed by the system 30, 35 years ago who have got to be trained in OBE, and it also presents a challenge in that this is somebody who left school probably, let's say, 35 years ago. Now they've got to undergo training, and resources have got to be pumped to ensure that they are trained. Modern day South Africa is trying very hard to ensure that children receive quality education from all fronts. However, some of the challenges remain HIV and poverty. Predominantly black parents cannot pay for school fees. I was just telling somebody now that it takes a mere lousy $70 per year to get a child into school, into the public education system. It depends on you as a parent in South Africa, whether you have the resources or not to get your child into private education. Some parents opt for private education because they feel the public education system is not doing justice to the children's education. Now, if you have the resources, which not many people have, you can opt for private education. If not, you have no option but to opt for the public education system. In the public education system, education is not free in South Africa. Children literally have to go, parents have to buy books and uniform. Some parents, especially in the rural areas, cannot afford to put a meal on the table, let alone pay $70 for a year. So that's where Books for Africa comes up, in that they relieve the parents of the burden. They at least provide books. Then it's a question of uniform, which most principals at schools in South Africa would now have a solution for that and say, okay, if it's so hard for parents to buy uniform for children, then let them come to school in their own clothes. We'll make it a point that we donate uniform for them and make sure that at least they wear uniform when they come to school. HIV and AIDS also presents a challenge to the South African government. It is a fact that South Africa is one of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa that has been badly affected by the HIV disease. You find that in most cases, both parents are deceased, and the eldest, maybe a 12-year-old, is the head of the household, still has got to go to school, still has got to find resources to ensure that she or he puts a meal on the family's table. So HIV and AIDS is also another critical area where government experiences challenge, in that it affects education. If a household is headed by a 12-year-old, obviously there won't be food to eat. Then when they go to school, the first thing they do is sleep while the teacher is teaching, because they didn't sleep at night, they were tendering for the younger ones, and they don't have food. So how the government tries to address that challenge is that the welfare system has to play a role. They've got to ensure that kids that are affected by HIV/AIDS at least get grants from government. At least the school is notified that this child is the head of the household and is only 12 years old. Then they would ensure that the social workers then play a role in that. They would register those children to get grants. They would ensure that there are foster parents who look after those children. And then they would ensure that at least those kids get a meal lunch meal at school to ensure that they don't land on an empty stomach. Those are some of the challenges that the South African government faces. Obviously, we are trying to address them, and I hope I've mentioned everything in regards to education. It will still take a long way to address the legacy of apartheid and the impact that that legacy has had on the education system in South Africa. The main thing, the chief thing that you need to know about the education system in South Africa is it reflects a disparity, which is a feature of our society. And South Africa being a mixed economy, there's a capitalist element there and state intervention at some levels. It will take time for the bridge between the rich and the poor is growing because of the capitalist economic model that the country is following. However, there's state intervention that ensures that people are not left behind. So that disparity is likely to be a feature of the South African society, not only on education, but also on health and all other aspects for some time now. Up until everybody's on the same level, on the same footing, there'll still be people who will opt for public education in South Africa, and they'll be in the rural areas. Obviously, you can't move them from the rural areas, and it will still be a challenge to get the resources flowing into the rural areas, in that you have to start by something basic, by providing water, running water, electricity, to ensure that the school structure has got electricity and water. And that will flow only from the communities. If the government has catered for the communities, then they would have to equally cater for the schools. So the disparity feature in the education system of South Africa, I believe, will be a feature for some time to come now. However, the government of President Jacob Zuma made a political decision to spread the Ministry of Education into two and have a tertiary education ministry, which will focus mainly on tertiary education and ensure that tertiary in education in South Africa provides quality and excellent education, and also basic education to ensure that school beginners up to the level of matric or end of high school diploma also get excellent education. So it's been only 6 months since the government of President Zuma has taken over administration in South Africa, and we hope to see that political decision being implemented and improving the quality of education in South Africa. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists for providing some very thought-provoking comments and perspective on the challenges to literacy and education in Africa. I certainly hope their comments have stimulated some questions from you. And so at this time, are there questions from the audience? Yes, please. Would you mind introducing yourself and then framing your question, please? The question basically was, what role can journalism play in addressing the issue of literacy in Africa?
I would say write interesting things that people like to read. Again, create that reading culture. But also, I think, to try to, I think if journalists make a study of how to frame issues in a constructive way, how to help stimulate a debate on education policy, on education investment, on rights and obligations. I think this would be enormously helpful. I think we see in the newspapers in Asia often education makes the front page. And I think it's the case in Africa often as well. But how do we write an intelligent story that really moves the dialogue forward and helps set a tone, a constructive tone?
What's an example you can give of a story that you especially thought did all of those things?
I had a funny experience. I had a press conference scheduled once with the Minister of Education in Malaysia, and I never said a word because there were 50 journalists around, and they were all concerned about a recent accident in a school where I think a roof or floor had collapsed, and a teacher was unfortunately killed. But they wrote an excellent story, actually, and it drew on sort of statistics about the conditions of classrooms in the country. It asked, it wasn't sensational. It said, why is this happening in a state where the money is coming? And it gave a whole picture of the school. It educated people about what is going on in the whole school system. It took views from a number of different parts of society as to what could be done to make a difference. And it generated an incredibly good discussion. It was analytical, but not above people's heads. It was written in a way that reached a large number of people in a very intelligent way and crystallized an issue.
Okay. I have a question over here.
Yes, tourist ambassador Augustine, and also a gentleman from the World Bank can also comment on this. Being at the UN and having an opportunity to be from Africa and also look at the world arena from your place, why can African governments, and what are the obstacles that are stopping from African governments to recreate the success of countries like Singapore and Malaysia and these Asian countries that in the 60s, same time when African countries become independent, really have the same levels of schooling and education? Can you pinpoint a few things that are making these things possible or not possible that countries like Tanzania and Ghana and that didn't have a lot of civil war and a lot of other African countries, why can that same experience be repeated in Africa and have high levels of schooling regardless of what the Millennium Development Goals are or the UN is doing? So if that makes sense, that's my question.
Before I answer that question, I just wanted to add to your question on the media and education. In Tanzania, we have a program called on the radio, on the television, called Haki Elimu, the right to education, which is so controversial. It points out loopholes and questions and shortcomings, and it's run by an NGO. And there was a time the government even got so nervous they were going to ban it, but there was a public uproar. And its focus is just on education. And it is really interesting. It raises issues, ethical issues, I think issues of standards of teachers and that. Of course, it depends on the degree of openness and how the media and the press is tolerated. The second example is at the time when Tanzania had this socialist experiment, the economy went very badly, but literacy was 90%. That's adult education literacy. And the way people maintained their literacy was to read the Swahili press. You distribute it in the rural areas. And people read about their own activities. They don't read about the Mississippi River. Who was asking about the So if the media could be, first of all, localized and report on things that people do, it maintains their level of literacy. I think this, again, it depends on the degree of openness and how the media is, the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech is tolerated in emerging democratic societies. Coming back to your question, when I was at the University of Dar es Salaam, Lin Kuan Yew was attending a conference of non-aligned countries in Lusaka, and he stopped at the University of Dar es Salaam and gave a talk. And he said, this is a very good gathering, countries of non-aligned countries from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But I'm not going to give up my links with the North, and that is the developed countries. Let us have solidarity, but let's also open up relations with the developed countries. So this is the extent to which a country is open to the coming of ideas and ready to interact. The openness of a country goes a long way to show the extent to which you can get ideas, but the challenge is how to internalize and translate those ideas. The students, most of us have gone to American universities, British universities, Canadian universities. How do you translate that knowledge when you go back? The first challenge is go home, bring knowledge home, and then indigenize that challenge. But I think the real bottom line is leadership. It's leadership. The poverty of leadership in many countries has been responsible for the poverty of their people. And a good leadership, sometimes it's like a lottery. You have a good leader, sometimes you have a bad leader. But leaders are made. And one ways of making leaders is education, good education. And of course, the political system that you craft. But the example of others is always there. And I don't see any reason why one country should remain behind. When you have precedents, you have examples, and you can learn from others. But the challenge is, how do you translate the ideas of others to be useful to your own country? Yes.
So we'll take a question over here.
Yeah, my question again is about this whole confidence about the fact that if we educate so many people, there's going to be transformation in society. I'm very skeptical about the fact that education per se can bring about transformation in society, because we have to make a distinction between education and how we decide to use it. How we decide to use education is not an intellectual question, it's a moral and ethical question. Simply because somebody is educated, that doesn't guarantee to us that they're going to do something that is going to bring about transformation in society. And there are tons of evidence in the history of Western civilization to show that people have used education to dehumanize other people, not to humanize them. So my concern about the presentation is, under what ethical principles or what moral principles should shape the education of people in Africa? Because I got a book which has the names of people from Africa who received scholarship from the US government to come and study here. And they went back to Africa, and some of them committed some of the most horrendous things that you can think about against Africans. So I became very skeptical at that time when I was in graduate school that education per se, without either some kind of moral or ethical commitment, is going to be a panacea to the problems of Africa.
Thank you.
Education for what? Education is not a neutral thing. In Africa, where education is a rare commodity, it can be a double-edged sword. Those who have access to education can become parasitic elites. Our education, we create elites who prey on the masses, who there to accumulate power, wealth, and influence at the expense of the ordinary people. In fact, the education in Africa is an elitist education. By virtue of narrow access to education and by virtue of the content of education, you are educated to aspire to become an elite. You are educated to aspire. You are a Tanzanian aspiring to be an American in your own country. Or you are in Tanzania, but your mind has migrated to London. Yeah, your brain is not in Tanzania. It is in London. See? And this is the challenge of education. It's not easy. It's how to make that your education relevant and useful. And for us, where education is a rare commodity, it's even a greater challenge. Here, where education is a right to everybody, I mean, you can just send, but for us in Africa, you're right. You can have education and literally become bad and use that education. And the worst part of it is to perpetuate that elitism. How do you make education relevant to saving society? And this is where the curriculum issue challenge comes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I would also say that to answer your questions, it is important to link education with culture to ensure that when you teach children and educate children, you get them to realize that education is not about mental colonization and getting them to think otherwise. Education is about getting them to understand themselves as a people and be conscious of the fact that as a people they exist and they have a culture. It's very important that when you educate children, you move away from the mentality of thinking that by being educated, you become a better person, in that you look down on your culture and you look down on yourself as a person and think that you're not worth it or you're not enough. So it is important to balance what you teach the child and their culture, what culture stipulates. It is important to remind the children that, yes, you have to learn, but also you have to keep in mind that as a black person, you have a culture, especially in Africa, in that Africa is predominantly black. You have a culture, and what does your culture stipulate as opposed to what you are being taught? I mean, we saw a situation in South Africa where recently black children started to speak English, and when you ask them, what's your name, they would have this funny accent in pronouncing their names, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, you're losing your culture. You're not white, as the ambassador says. Your mind is not in Britain. That's why you called Zandile, or that's why I'm called Tiejo. There's a reason why I'm called Tiejo. I was taught that you have to balance between your education and your culture. Why would you teach children and mentally colonize them and get them to think that by being education, you perpetuate that elitist mentality. By being education, you change as an African and you don't become who you used to be. You become a better person, almost whiter than what you're supposed to be, and you forget about where you come from. For me, it's a question of balancing the culture, reminding kids that we are where we are as a people in Africa because we have culture, and we have to balance what we learn with what our culture prescribes.
Okay. Thank you very much. To be respectful of your time and our panelists' time, I'm going to entertain one more question. Yes, gentlemen. Right here.
Thank you very much for being here today. I had a question that seems to be coming up several times today, both in the conversation with Secretary Johnnie Carson, as well as here with the panelists. We attain, or we aim for this level of education, which is a wonderful thing, but we hit a ceiling, whether it be primary school educated children who have no use for their education once they're finished, or people who go through secondary education or tertiary education and leave the country because there's no use for their education in the country. Secretary Johnnie Carson had mentioned that we need to have policies that don't force our educated to be in the nation, but encourage them to be in the nation. And I'm curious what policies are being implemented by Tanzania or South Africa or other African nations that are encouraging their educated to stay in their nation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I would say for as long as the political situation in most African countries remains what it is, and for as long as globalization is at the center of economics in the international arena, some people will find it more appealing to go look for greener pastures. I mean, you're talking about a situation where you literally leading me to compare between the North and the South. Obviously, developing countries have got less to offer as opposed to developed countries. So some people feel that in the global recession, economic recession era, where we're witnessing governments literally going down and corporations going down, cutting on budget, people will feel the pinch to leave their countries and go somewhere else where they can get greener pastures. But as the Ambassador Carson so rightfully said, you cannot force them to stay in one place, even if there's a policy for any African country to say the educated people must remain in their nations. You cannot force them anyhow. It's about, for me, it's about giving back to your community, the commitment from the individual to giving back to their community. In my case, the South African government, the then South African government led by the first black president, Mr. Mandela, I think they introduced a program called the Renaissance, where they encouraged us as young people to go out there to ensure that South Africa is represented internationally. I was chosen as a student to go study international relations in a traditionally white institution. And after that, the government gave me an option to say, look, it's up to you. You can go out there and get a job. We've educated you in partnership with your parents. It's up to you what you want to do. But I decided to give back to my own people and my own community, in that I said to myself, if government took it upon themselves to educate me, I think it's up to me as an individual to give back to government. That's how I landed in this job. It's up to the individual, the educated, to decide to give back to their communities, or to be selfish and turn their backs and say, I'm going for greener pastures. You can have an excellent policy in place. If the individual is not committed to giving back to their society, there's nothing much you can do, especially in the coercion factor does not come into play in the equation. If the individual is set on, like the ambassador saying, with a mindset in Britain, they will go to Britain. But if you're committed, if you are a true African who understands what Africa is all about, you will want to give back to your people. You will come to the United States or go to Britain or Canada to study, but you will think back and say, I'm an African, as President Thabo Mbeki always says, and give back to your community. So it's all about the individual and the ideals that the individual cherishes. If you cherish a Western ideal, you will stay in the West. But if you cherish an African ideal, you'll go back home and make a difference in Africa.
I think shaping nationalism in the positive sense, not in the negative sense, and the patriotism begins at a very early age. From primary education, I think it is important that the kids are groomed to becoming patriotic to their country. It's like it's not propaganda. It's like the feeling of belonging and of service to the society should be part of the education from the very beginning. And as you grow up, whether you are studying at home or studying abroad, the first big incentive is job security. If you can be assured, for example, when I finished my doctoral degree at the University of Toronto and in Berkeley, I was assured of a job at the University of Dar es Salaam. And I gladly went back because I was sure I have a job there. But sometimes you get a job and you don't have the tools to work with. You may be a doctor, you may be an engineer, you may be a professor, but there are no books, there are no journals, there's no research. Then really you get very, very discouraged. And again, this is the policies to invest in facilities, if you are a doctor, to give you those kinds of things that you require. But also, we have seen people who don't go back to their own countries when they come to study. It's not only because they have no jobs, but because there are no opportunities of having dual exposure to where they have been and to where they belong. For example, today, for the first time, in Houston, where there are over 500 Tanzanians, there is a big symposium where the issue of dual citizenship is being discussed for Tanzanians who have been in the United States, whether they can retain Tanzania citizenship as well as American citizenship or some kind of status. And that would encourage people to invest and go back and forth and live, and probably while having their kids train here, but at the same time giving them an opportunity to go back to Tanzania and invest. These are some of the incentives. It sounds easy, but sometimes it's very difficult. You don't see what is in the minds of people. But the freedom to move as a result of globalization certainly should be there. But if you were exposed to the patriotic sentiments very early on, and you are merged into the culture, as she says, it becomes a moral obligation to feel you are part of your country. I've seen Americans in my country. They've done wonderful things for my country, but they are still Americans. And when the national anthem of the United States is played, the hand goes right there. Instinctively, why? So it can be done, but for young nations, it has to be groomed, it has to be built. And again, it's the function of culture and the combination of education. But it's part of the challenges of young emerging nations.
Again, on behalf of the University of Minnesota and our Partners Book for Africa, I'd like to just personally thank our panelists, and especially thank you, the participants in this great discussion, for being here and for engaging us in this important dialogue. So let's give our panelists another round of applause. I'm going to pass it back to Pat.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Well, this has been an exciting conference. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. We hope that you found this an opportunity to learn, to share, and to make some connections. Thank you again to the University of Minnesota for making this conference possible. Thank you again to all of our panelists, our sponsors, and vendors for participating in this event. Please note that vendor tables remain open next door, and please visit them if you have the opportunity later in this course of the evening. Please also note that you're all invited to visit our Books for Africa warehouse tomorrow for a noon barbecue. It's a South African-style braai. You can see the books. You can enjoy some barbecue and wine, courtesy of MT Global Wines and the Minnesota South African Business Alliance. And so now we invite you to join us for the closing reception in the atrium, and we can all carry on our conversations out there. Thank you very much.